I've always been comfortable jumping around between more than one book at a time. Usually, this has been a method of keeping myself motivated and interested in what I'm reading. Sometimes I'm not in the mood for history writing or for philosophy, and sometimes I want to have some fiction, sometimes I want to have some poetry to adopt instead. And so that's generally meant that for many years, I've read about 3 to 4 books at a time fairly regularly, usually spread out at different times of the day. And that's been fairly normal for me. I know that some people think that jumping around between books is a kind of flippant way to read, wherein you're not fully dedicating yourself to any one realm of thinking and storytelling. But in this case, it feels to me that each type of book is a different segment of mind and also a different mood. And I guess in some sense, I am a mood reader in that way, where even though I am very consistent about the time that I spend with reading and the slots in the day in which I devote to reading, the type of reading that I do is dependent very much on the feel of the moment. Now, this month in particular has been an especially odd month in terms of the range and number of works that I've had to read. And the reason why I've had to read so many this month at the same time will make a bit more sense later in this video when I fully explain it. But the thing to know is that I've been jumping around from history to political and economic nonfiction to poetry to fiction itself to a lot of very thick philosophy. And it's actually helped me understand some of the benefit of reading multiple books at the same time, and that each of these separate genres, as much as they seem to encompass a whole different realm or framework of thinking about the world, they relate to one another in so much as all of these sorts of questions that this material is circling around is questions about ourselves and our relations to each other. When we read history books, we're essentially reading about experiments with humanity, the ways that human foibles and habits repeat themselves time and again. And there is this connection, this threading between the philosophy one can read about striving to understand the world, and then the history one reads about with figures attempting to engage with the world. And then also the fiction that we read about, wherein we have this internal deep psyche brimming with associations and thoughts and drives, and where those drives come from can relate to some of the neuroscience that you're reading, or can relate to general cognitive psychology. And it's this jumping around between each of these topics that really brings them into relation. It becomes a means of using what it is that you're reading, because you're thinking, how does what I read in this other book relate to this one now? How do these concepts fold one atop the other? It's almost like a Russian doll with broader concepts that apply wholesale, such as philosophy, nested within the internalized poetics of language in poetry, and then nested within the broader societal experimentation of different cultures and times in history, and then nested within the fictionalized worlds of imagination that can be found in a really great fiction book. And it's this kind of nested quality of all of these things relating to each other, not feeling perfectly bounded. And so it's nice to jump around like that between all of these different books. So like I said, this month has been especially intense in terms of the number of books I've been jumping between. So I think there's going to be a lot for you to chew on as a viewer in terms of possible recommendations of things that you might want to read yourself. I'm going to try to just introduce some of the books that I'm reading. I hope that some of these are intriguing to you. If you want me to review any of these, like a full video review, let me know. I'll try not to talk too much at length about each one, although I'm sure I have plenty to say in regards to the content in each book. But let me know which ones you would want me to review. I can't review all of them, I don't think. It would just take too much time, but I'm sure some of these would seem especially interesting to you. And it's really jumping between a range of genres of literature to read. So here is what I've been up to lately. I try to kind of segment my day for each of these types of books. So in the morning, I would think these are my main reads. These are the ones that I'm fully dedicated to and I commit myself to every day as a consistent reading practice. And the first main book that I have each morning is The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William L. Shire. So this is one that I'm pretty sure I'm only reading because of Steve Donahue. So, you hear this plenty on this channel where Steve Donahue recommends something or he talks about it at length, and it just makes me so curious that I feel like I have to read it. Of course, we all know about the Third Reich, i.e. Nazi Germany, but this book is well known for being a popular history of the Third Reich written fairly soon after by someone who was a journalist in the first half of Nazi Germany's rise. And it is that personal connection to this history that makes it unusual for a history book. A lot of history books are written in retrospect with a distance of often generations. And it is that distance in time that is supposed to deliver a kind of objectivity in terms of what is assessed out of the historical record. But in this case, we have an author who wears their bias directly on their sleeve for all to see. And it is that bias that is actually the most intriguing element of it. We have someone who was in Germany during this transitional period into Nazification. And he has that direct, bitter memory of an extraordinary country falling from its grace and intellectual brilliance into a social contagion of discrimination and simplistic paranoid conspiracy. And it is those little hints of his personal connection to this history that makes it a very unique history book. He writes it densely, such that you still get a lot of what you would expect in a history book. It has a story-like narrative where it's going chronologically through events. You get this kind of odd rise of this otherwise failure, Hitler, and how his obsessions begin to manifest and spread among all of these other political figures in Germany. Amidst all of that more predictable history, there are these moments of interruptions where the author places himself back at the forefront, and he will just give his impressions of things. And it's those little moments that are refreshing when they occur, because even though they feel less objective, they feel far more true to the feeling of the moment of witnessing your society begin to crumble and succumb to the worst, most base habits of our human nature. And it is those scenes that can sometimes feel like a direct mirror of our own time, the ways in which the kind of information that we identify with easiest is sometimes the information that simplifies a large swath of people and gives you a feeling of having been built up really only merely because you've pushed others down. And it is that temptation that's always on the margins of what humans are capable of that makes this particular history especially fascinating. I, of course, just like you, have learned plenty about Nazi Germany, but I like reading this now classic work of history just to get a sense of what has made it so popular, and I can feel that voice through and through in this. There's this one moment, and by the way, I'm about 250 pages in so far, where he describes how effectively the propaganda was slowly building up and how it was beginning to take over the neighbors that he had otherwise grown used to, the intellectuals in the sphere of his friendships. And he says, "I would meet with the most outlandish assertions from seemingly educated and intelligent persons. It was obvious that they were parroting some piece of nonsense they had heard on the radio or read in the newspapers. Sometimes one was tempted to say as much, but on such occasions one was met with such a stare of incredulity, such a shock of silence, as if one had blasphemed the Almighty, that one realized how useless it was even to try to make contact with a mind which had become warped and for whom the facts of life had become what Hitler and Goebbels, with their cynical disregard for truth, said they were." And if you're anything like me, you've noticed how often conversations with some groups of people can feel like a repetition of talking points as opposed to a genuine, curious, evolving, adaptive conversation. And he captures that feeling so well of how in being inundated with information, we tend to lean towards simplification in order to grasp what feels too plentiful to leave complex. And so this desire to know then becomes a desire to simplify. And that's when you get people repeating the talking points that make them feel smart, as opposed to doing the actual work of needing to leave things nuanced and complicated. And I love that familiarity in that paragraph. It's also horrible to read this paragraph because it ends up feeling like a society succumbing to the simplicity of an availability heuristic born of the most contrarian stances being the easiest to latch onto, because by being contrarian, you feel different, and by feeling different, you feel special. And that drive to have your ego be satisfied by specialness from the norm makes it so that even the worst kinds of least reliable hot takes one can find become so tempting just so that you can feel different and extraordinary. And it is that human desire to feel special, to feel smart, that seems to be at play so much when it comes to these populist movements, wherein they tether to those weaknesses in our psyche, the ways in which we are so insecure that we need to feel a part of something. I like that element of opinion that keeps weaving its way in and out of this history book so far. And this is the most popular book that I'll be talking about in this video, but so far I get it. I get why it is as popular as it is. I like it as a way into Nazi history. I think it might be really a great starting point when you're finally getting outside of just what you learned in school about Nazi Germany to get into some of that more denser history. There are other history books that are probably more accurate, even more detailed than this one. I know that there's the 3-volume Richard J. Evans History of Nazi Germany, and there is the 2-volume biography by Ian Kershaw of Hitler. Those are well known as being excellent, more recent histories of Nazi Germany. And there's various other books that I definitely plan to get to. But I like this as a starting point just to get that feel of, oh, there's a horrifying familiarity here of the ways that people attach to not just a personality cult of a single figure, but attach themselves and identify with arguments and ideas in a way that makes them very rigid and incapable of noticing the flaws within those ideas. I think it's important not to identify yourself too much, especially morally, with one single way of viewing things. It is nice, and it's not as hard as it seems, to just let yourself kind of flow between ideas a while. But anyway, this book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William L. Shirer, is a really interesting overview of Nazi Germany, while also giving those little reminders of how much of the habits that lead to such a destructive state of being are habits that are still with us, and it's important to avoid as much as we possibly can. So anyway, that is The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William L. Shirer. And then another set of books that is part of my morning reads, part of that very first thing I do in the day in order to set the register for the rest of the day, is the 3 poetry collections by Bren Booth Jones, who I would call my BookTube newbie brother. We started regularly posting on BookTube at around the same time. And since we've become deep friends, we've had long conversations with each other, and he is so easy to talk to for not just those bookish conversations, but also just conversations about the self generally. And he invited me to host his book launch on Sunday, the 29th of June. In preparation for hosting that book launch, I've been reading and rereading his poetry books again and again, and it's been a really nice way back into taking poetry seriously, which is something I haven't had to do since I think when I was in college, and when I do work as an editor from time to time, of course. But it's been putting me back into that headspace of appreciation for what poetry offers that's different than other forms of writing. And I'll save a lot of what I have to say about his books for the proper time and place. I'm going to have to talk quite a bit at length about each of these books for the book launch. And by the way, that book launch is for this book, Blue Remembered Star, which is his latest collection of poetry. But one thing that I will say is that reading the poetry of someone that you've grown to know is a different kind of gift than just reading that of a stranger. Because as we get to know people, there's always going to be a certain amount of veneer atop who they are that is born of the need to communicate. And when you get into someone's poetry, there is a different part of themselves that is perhaps a little bit more delicate and frail And it is that needing to nurture that part of themselves and then to put it out to you. It can feel like you're connecting with someone in a way that, for me at least, I wish we could always connect in that way. And it has been so nice to read a book of poetry from a friend, to really read it closely and annotate all over. But I'm reading these 3 poetry books, and that is another part of my morning read. So it's a bit of an extreme contrast. Obviously, I read about Nazi Germany for an hour, and then as much time as I can fit in after, I then am reading these 3 poetry books. Although that seems like 2 totally opposite ends of the spectrum of human experience, it's the truth in both that links them together for me. And both of those truths are still very revealing about the human psyche and our insecurities generally. I think the most beautiful thing about poetry is that it puts our insecurities at the forefront. And one of the most wonderful things about history is that it allows the effects of our insecurities to be portrayed in some. Maybe so much of the choices we make in the world is born of insecurity. And it's interesting to see the different ways of telling both of those truths about us. He begins one of his poems with the line, "Beneath the surface of our small talk whisper aquifers of why." And within these poems, I find aquifers sometimes of myself. As far as starting the day, there's very few ways that could be better than that. So those are the books that I'm reading first thing in the morning. But then I have what I would consider the midday books. These are the books that I will grab whenever I get a chance during the day while I'm busy with other things. And I can read them in small chunks. And the idea is these books lend themselves better to more shorter sprints of reading. Maybe because they are themselves little short pockets of satisfaction, or as you'll see in some of the later examples, they are dense enough that you're going to want to read maybe 1 or 2 pages at a time and not more than that. So the first book is going to be along the smoother sense of that time constraint, and that is Julio Cortázar's Blow Up and Other Stories. Now the first titular story here, Blow Up, is one that I had to read in college, and it was kind of my first introduction to some of the metatextual play that can occur in a story. It opens with these multiple switches between first and second and third person point of view in order to question the very nature of how to tell the story that is being told. And of course, that metatextual play is not just the author freewheeling his way around writing. Rather, it also lines up nicely with the broader theme of the story, having to do with how we frame things, with the main character attempting to take photographs of single moments and interpreting those photographs in particular ways, and then some of the questions that arise out of those interpretations and how to interpret limited information within a frame. I don't know why I decided to go back to Julio Cortázar. It's been many, many years since I read that initial story, Blow Up, but it just struck me impulsively to just give him another shot. I think perhaps it's because there are other books by him, bigger novels that I wanted to get to, and it struck me as, wait, I should go back to those short stories because Blow Up was such a incredibly tightly constructed story. It made me curious what else he can do, and I'm so glad I did. He's a surrealist writer in the sense that he allows our unconscious impulses to drive so much of the movement within his stories. He has one story called A House Taken Over, wherein there is a brother and sister who are intimately connected with each other in the sense of feeling completely detached from everyone else around them. And so they just live alone together in this home. But over time, rooms within the home are starting to be taken over by mysterious others whom we never get to see or grasp in terms of their place in this world. And as the rooms continuously get taken over one after the other, the brother and sister just move themselves away. Rather than fight for those rooms back, they just stay together and migrate from place to place until eventually, as the title suggests, the whole house is taken over and they just leave it for whoever those strangers are. And it has this strong metaphorical feeling of being about that loneliness and detachment from society and the rest of the world, the feeling of being pushed out and not quite knowing why, and that feeling of having a small few who you can connect with, and how that becomes the balm out of this otherwise lonely space. It's that emotional tether that this story has. And then it just keeps going in that way. There's little bits of humor. There's this one epistolary-like story where you have a letter being written to a woman who had let the letter writer stay in her home, and he's apologizing for all of the destruction in her home, and his excuse for why this destruction occurred is because he couldn't stop vomiting up rabbits. And he has no explanation for why these rabbits kept emerging. Julio Cortázar's willingness to toy with such a ridiculous premise in order to have an unreliable narrator that isn't merely just a psychodrama of horror, instead being an unreliable narrator who is self-consciously trying to excuse his behavior with absurdity. And you don't know how honest he is or how much it is an actual magic realism story of rabbits coming out of someone's mouth, or how much that is just an absurd lie. It's just the fun of having a story ride on that kind of absurdity the whole way through, but then committing to that and having also little hints of beauty. Julio Cortázar is a fantastic writer of prose. There are passages in here, little paragraphs, even though it sometimes feels like it's not fully outlined with a broader end that's going to recontextualize everything that came before. It doesn't matter because it has that feeling of you just playing with an author, writing for its own sake, like art for its own sake. It's just the beauty of the prose and the ways that it, just like history, just like poetry, this fiction can reveal something about ourselves, and it's finding ourselves in that relation that makes it so worthwhile. So anyway, that is Julio Cortázar, Blow Up and Other Stories. I'm about halfway through this one. So this is when I get to the other set of midday books that has caused the amount of books that I'm reading at the same time to expand. And the reason that this is happening is there is a essay contest called the John Locke Essay Competition. It's for middle and high school students. And a lot of my students who I teach at the very end of the school year, they got very excited to attempt this contest and they asked me to help them. And so I can't help them write it directly, but what I am allowed to do is to talk to them about their ideas and to give them feedback and push them a little bit in terms of the specificity of the arguments that they make. Each of the prompts for this essay competition is devoted to a highly philosophical concept. And each of these philosophy questions is inviting young students to really have to think hard beyond the material that they rotely memorize in high school and actually think for themselves by, at the same time, acknowledging all of the extensively layered argumentation from philosophers many years before. And I have such fantastic students who really want to dedicate themselves to tough material like this. And so in order to do them a service of actually giving them a conversation partner who can keep up with the material and challenge them to think harder, I've decided to dive into the Oxford Handbook series of books that I have. I have quite a lot of Oxford Handbook books, and for anyone who doesn't know, these are curated essays by some of the top academics in any given field. And it's a kind of overview of a subject by ranging over all of the different nuanced, very specific subfields within a broader field. And it's kind of an introduction into these subjects, but it's really more of a smattering of dense arguments connected to a field. It's seemingly intended for graduate students instead of the layman. So the expectation is there's going to be a lot of jargon and you're going to have to define a lot of those words for yourself as you go. But if you're willing to slow down and take it in, I think the Oxford Handbooks is some of the best ways to get a deep dive into a lot of these subjects that isn't just popular nonfiction philosophy. So the three that I am trying to read in order to help my students as much as I can is the Oxford Handbook of Epistemology, the Oxford Handbook of Reasons and Normativity, and the Oxford Handbook of the Philosophy of Language. It helps that these are not the first time I've familiarized myself with these subjects. These are quite a bit tougher to get into than some other more gentler introductions. But it has been nice to try to refresh and get into some of the weeds of these otherwise very complicated philosophical subjects so that my students aren't just opting for the surface level means of tackling the essay prompts that they choose, and I get to just push them a bit harder than they otherwise would have been pushed. One thing that I've learned as a teacher is you can teach students almost any subject. I think students are smarter than they might seem on the surface. It comes across like their attention is fully scattered by all of the distractions born of our internet craving world. But so much of that attention scattering is really just them attempting to judge out of a kind of efficiency for their time. So if you're willing to be passionate enough about a subject and care deeply about a subject, that level of care is infectious enough that you can make almost any student curious to actually do the hard work of learning what seems like an insurmountable task. So it's been fun actually going through these books and trying to help them. I'm going to try not to talk too much at length about each of these. Let me just sum up what each of these books are about. So the Oxford Handbook of Epistemology. Epistemology is just the study of knowledge, really more the limits of our knowledge, the ways that in order to justify knowing something, we have to have a standard of justification. But of course, what is the justification for that standard? And you can see how it just becomes a loop of questioning all the way down. And epistemology tries to struggle with the notion of foundations in one's knowledge. There is what's called foundationalism, where we actually have non-inferential knowledge, knowledge that doesn't rely on inferences born of other beliefs. And what would those foundations be? It tends to be the case that a lot of our beliefs are reliant on a whole web of other beliefs. So then it ends up seeming like the only foundations that we can actually have for knowledge would be perception, sensation, and memory. But then even in that case, we know that our perception, sensation, and memory is born of our embodied existence, and there are limitations to what our bodies have been honed to process. It's not like we evolved for truth. We evolved for survival and propagation of genes. So it could very well be the case that the means by which we perceive the world is going to be artificially limited for the sake of survival and propagation of genes. So then where do we get our knowledge from? Of course, you can have the scientific branch of knowledge of accumulating and testing evidence, but when it comes to accumulating evidence, there is the problem of induction, where you can accumulate all the amount of evidence that you want, but there's always going to be more evidence outside of the sphere you have access to thus far. And it is that perpetual increase of evidence that takes away the opportunity for certainty. And of course, you can have contradictory evidence directly outside of your purview. And it is that lack of what you don't know that makes it so that science will always be limited by what evidence we have access to. And then, of course, that leads to science merely being not a means of proving information, but instead falsifying the information we have so we can narrow down to something. But that series of falsification doesn't prove anything at any point. Really, it can only falsify perpetually. And maybe that's the closest we can get to a kind of knowledge, is a practical, constantly testing and just removing bad ideas, but not necessarily ever reaching an endpoint of certainty. Of course, there's also the pragmatic view of knowledge, where you go with what works, and what works is enough. You don't need to have certainty. Who cares? But of course, in order to be pragmatic, you still have to have a theory of being able to know what is useful or what works. Because if you claim that, oh, I'm only doing what works, that is still a claim about knowledge of what works. So it kind of circles in on itself still. But then, of course, you can have intuitionism, where you just go by our intuition. It's just go with what's obvious. Why are we systematizing so much? Why is it that analytic philosophy needs to place things into boxes and make it so rigidly like mathematic connections from thought to thought to thought? Maybe logic itself is only a tool limited within one small set of grasping the world. But of course, when it comes to that kind of intuition, our intuitions differ, and our intuitions carry a wide variety of personal biases, either born from experience or born out of our needs as an embodied cognition. So there's all these different questions about how do you get to knowledge. And this book, the Oxford Handbook of Epistemology, goes through a lot of very disagreeing ways of understanding knowledge. And it is that fact of having this be a collection of different philosophers within this field that means you're not just going to get one overview of epistemology. You're really getting many different ways of looking at resolving this problem. And, the broad conclusion, and this is a conclusion I get anytime I read philosophy, is that we don't really have a way to get to the bottom of a lot of these problems. And maybe one of the biggest lessons you can learn from philosophy is starting to be okay with uncertainty and starting to be okay with merely learning for its own sake and for the wonder that it delivers. And it is that perpetual learning, the idea that you're never going to be done, that is actually the most satisfying thing about learning philosophy. And then, of course, if we're getting into knowledge and how it is that we can have knowledge or know something, we also have to think, well, what sort of reasons is this knowledge? How do we know when we are doing the best thing that we could do in response to the data on offer to us? And that's where the Oxford Handbook of Reasons and Normativity comes in. This gets into the question of what are the sorts of reasons worth attending to? What is happening psychologically as we respond to reasons of various sorts? And then what is this notion of normativity? There's this differing view of reasons. There's what's called motivating reasons, which are the reasons that actually motivate us. And then there are what's called normative reasons. And these are the reasons that so-called should motivate us. And that notion of should comes from an ideal set of thinking, where if you were your ideal self that attended to the facts as they are and didn't just merely follow the whims of bias, what would be the best course of action on that basis? And it is somewhat an ideal, and it's somewhat an artificial ideal. And this book tries to really dive into, well, what are those different kinds of shoulds? What is the meaning of making something normative, making something a set rule? We're clearly not motivated always by set rules, by telling people that there is one way to do things. But should we be motivated? And what is that gap between the is and the ought that Hume had pointed out so long ago? And so that's where reasons and normativity comes in. And this is an especially thick book. It's going to take me a really long time to get through the whole thing. But it is, again, just like the other one, it's a lot of differing perspectives and differing ways of tackling this issue of reasons and normativity. I would say that this one and the next one are really only for people who really, really like analytic philosophy. It's not for everyone. The epistemology book, I think, can be enjoyable for a lot of people. This one and the next one is really only for the hardcore philosophy nuts who don't mind how rigid and unemotional analytic philosophy can be. And then the last of the thick Oxford handbooks I'm going through is Philosophy of Language. There is way too much to say about philosophy of language. It's in some ways become what analytic philosophy is just philosophy of language. But the only thing worth saying is it's an attempt to try and dissect the potential confusions of language and how those confusions can sometimes lead to metaphysical certainties that we should not otherwise have, and how by looking closely at what we mean when we say things like you should do something, what is the underlying structure of our language that leads to those sorts of claims? Are we pointing to something out in the world? Are we pointing to something we believe? Are we pointing to something that we just intuit? It's those kinds of differences of what is language doing in the world that makes philosophy of language so compelling and so complicated in analytic philosophy today. And like I said, there's a lot I could say about this topic. I'm completely cutting out the long tail of history behind philosophy of language, like Plato's ideal forms, or Aristotle's segmentation into categories of language, or Ferdinand de Saussure's semiotics, or Nietzsche and his view of metaphorical use of language, or Frege and his sense and reference distinction within the content of what is being referred to, or Wittgenstein and his notion that words are not definitions, words are their use, and it's a kind of language game that we're playing with one another, and it's not so much about having a defined meaning for a word, but rather a kind of familiar, loose relation between the words. There's so much history behind the arguments in philosophy of language, but I just want to point this out for the really hardcore viewers out there who like deep dives into philosophy. I mean, this is as deep a dive as you're going to get into philosophy of language. It is definitely not a starting point into philosophy of language. You should already know a lot of the general broad overviews of the material, and you should already know symbolic logic to a great extent. There's a ton of symbolic logic throughout this book, so it is not easy in that way. But this is the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy of Language. Now, there are two other books that I was reading in order to help my students, but I'm basically done with both of these books now. The first one is The Meritocracy Trap by Daniel Markovits. I realize I've been talking so much already, so I'm going to try to sum this up briefly. Basically, what the meritocracy trap argues is that we have a meritocratic ideal wherein the merit of someone's abilities rewards them economically and socially. Via that incentive, we end up tunneling people into an extreme level of exploitation of both themselves and their children. And it also leads to more than just an economic gap, it becomes a gap of expertise, such that society begins to run on one form of ability in the world, a kind of conventional form of what works within the technocratic society that we have. And then all of those who have not had the benefit of being able to learn those abilities, they end up falling further and further behind within what matters in our society. There is a certain amount of choice about what it is that should be rewarded. And his argument is partially that we tend to reward a very specific subset of skills and not others. And it is the overwhelming and increasing benefits of those specific rewards that is going to lead to a huge chasm between the haves and the have-nots in that regard. It's similar to other kinds of inequality arguments that I'm sure you've heard of. They tend to focus on economic or racial differences, but this one is really focused on the differences in achievement behavior, the ways that parents who know that their social status and economic success emerges out of a very regimented kind of expertise. Well, what they're going to do is they're going to pay for the biggest private schools, the best tutors. They're going to be pushing their students more and more for the sake of academic success and networking. And it's this boot camp-like education that then just worsens over time because the bar is continuously getting higher and higher and higher. And as that bar gets higher and higher, you need more resources to start with to even be able to give your children that kind of benefit. And then it just makes it even harder for anyone else to compete in that same regard. And he kind of makes the argument that this is not a tenable situation for society at large. One of my students wanted to write about academic pressures because he is a student who feels precisely that. I mean, you can imagine that my students are like that because they want to do this essay in the first place. I wasn't the one trying to make them participate in this essay contest. I just told them about it. But some of that excitement is, of course, the pressure from parents for them to live up to a certain kind of ideal. And one of my students wanted to write about that. So I decided to read this book and then talk to him about it. And I gave him the book and he's reading it as well. But one of the other pressures that affect young people, of course, is the pressures of comparison. And comparison is so astute when it comes to comparison online on social media. So another book that I decided to read with my students is The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. And the thesis of this book is basically that information about what we do is a kind of raw resource that social media companies attempt to mine out of our data. And it is that mining of our data, of what we do, that then leads to the incentive of needing to not just collect more data from us, but to box us in compartmentalized identities in order to have that data be cleaner and more segmented. And it propels so much of the nature of algorithms. I'm sure you feel this all the time, even on something like YouTube, where the algorithm kind of assumes an identity for you and then forms that identity even more in order to make sure that you stay within a certain box. Because so long as you stay within a box, you are far easier to sell to an advertiser. And she goes through a lengthy bit of history of a lot of these technology companies and how they evolved over time from being a company that needed to increase its user base, such as Google search needed to become the most successful search engine. But once it became successful in that sense of having the majority of internet users use that search engine, then it doesn't matter how good the search engine is anymore. Now what matters is how can the search engine facilitate more data collection and, in particular, facilitate advertisers being able to reach the users that they want to reach. And then, of course, she talks about the spread of this out into other elements of our life. Now it's hard to buy a vacuum or a refrigerator or a washing machine or even light bulbs that aren't connected to Wi-Fi in order to distribute more data about who we are. These objects in our home vie to connect to our phones in order to accumulate that same data to send to those companies. And so it really becomes about how these companies best try to use the resources of our information in order to sell to the highest bidder for the sake of further profits. And it makes the internet worse and worse, not for our benefit, to the benefit of advertisers, but it also makes the experience one that is all-consuming and addictive, and most importantly, at least for her argument, it is an experience that narrows who we are into a very conveniently understood box of identity. And so that is this book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. And there's other books that we're reading. There's a recent release called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. That book is also trying to explain some of the broadly negative effects, especially on youth, that social media has. And the reason why we're reading these books is because one of the prompts in the John Locke competition is about the epidemic of depression and anxiety among young people. And so it's just sort of helpful subject matter to think about, well, what is some of the history that leads to this moment? What is distinct about the nature of social media at this point in time? And how did we get to this point? And of course, my student is spending a lot of time looking at the psychological effects of social media alongside the psychological effects of academic pressure and or comparison generally. So those are some of the books I've been reading. These two, the Meritocracy Trap and The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, I'm pretty much done with those. If you want me to review those individually, I can try, but I think I've kind of said what matters the most about them. I think they're both decent books. They're very journalistic and opinionated and editorial in that sense, selecting information that supports the particular argument that they're trying to make. So it should not be the only book that you read on these kinds of subjects. One challenge, especially in the case of the Daniel Markovits Meritocracy Trap book, is I don't find the solutions he offers particularly viable. It seems like it would just lead to other kinds of problems. So that isn't very helpful. It really just makes you abundantly aware of a problem, and then that problem feels all the worse because there doesn't seem to be a way out of it. So these are some of the books I'm reading for the midday. And then at the very end of the day, I'm not going to talk at length about these. These are the ones that I read on my Kindle. And on my Kindle, I'm currently reading Ducks Newburyport by Lucy Ellman, the daughter of Richard Ellman, who wrote a great biography of James Joyce. And I already discussed Ducks Newburyport in my 10 More Hard Books I Want to Read video. So you could just watch that and get my impressions of that book. I'm probably 1/4 of the way through. I'm not sure, actually, because it's on Kindle. But the other book that I'm reading on my Kindle is the Oxford Very Short Introduction to Philosophy of Law. And the reason I'm reading that one is because I was making my way through some of these essays in Garner on language and writing. And Garner, if you don't know, is the author of Garner's Modern English Usage. And so he is a dedicated grammarian who teaches language and usage in writing. And he has a whole wide variety of essays on the subject. But in particular, he has a lot of essays on law, on legal writing. And he spends so much time in these essays talking about how flawed the methods of teaching for legal writing is. In fact, there's barely any effort placed into making sure that lawyers know how to write, and how much confusion is then born out of that. And when you start to read all of these examples of how much legal writing can confound and confuse, it begins to make you wonder, oh, that is horrifying, since so much rides on the legal system being interpreted properly. So then it made me want to read about philosophy of law to get a sense of what are philosophers saying about the limits of legal understanding. Now, one thing, for those who are interested in learning philosophy, I want to really make a strong recommendation that people check out these very short introduction series. I think it's really nice to read them on Kindle because they're tiny little books anyway. But the thing that's so great about the very short introduction series of books, especially for learning philosophy, is I've read a lot of these big, broad overviews of philosophy. I've read Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy. I, not too long ago, read A.C. Grayling's History of Western Philosophy. and I've read histories of more modern and contemporary philosophy, but I always end up feeling very unsatisfied by the limited space that's given to each philosophical subject. And then, of course, that then pushes me to have to read the original sources, which is then a huge dedication of time. But I found that one of the best balances in between the two extremes of a short summary in a broad collection and an overly long dedication of time into the actual original works are these very short introduction series of books, because they're only about 200 pages in a tiny little box format, and it's enough information about one single philosopher that makes it better than an encyclopedia entry or an overview in one of these general philosophy books, but also deep enough so that it really makes you get a sense of the logic of the argument, so that when you decide to go to the original sources, you already feel like vaguely familiar, or at least have a mapping of what those sources are going to talk about. So if you're new to philosophy and you really want to dive into it, instead of just reading these broad overviews, and instead of just reading the source materials, and instead of just going to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is great but also expects a certain amount of base knowledge, try out the very short introduction series. The one on philosophy of law is actually so far my least favorite of the ones that I've read, but the ones about specific philosophers like Hume and Kant and so on, I think those are really valuable for actually getting like a decent start with this sort of material, especially with someone like Kant, for instance, which his critique of pure reason is very tough to get through. I recommend the Pluhar translation if you want to actually have a smooth read through of it, especially with someone like him. The very short introduction is fantastic. That one was written by Roger Scruton, who is a aesthetic philosopher, but he manages to communicate so clearly the broad ideas in Kant. So anyway, I'm rambling now, but basically, check out the very short introduction series when you can. I think it's a really nice way into otherwise dense material. So those are all the things that I've been reading all at the same time. And I hope that some of these are interesting to you. I mentioned before, let me know which books you want me to review. There's plenty of books that I've been finishing and not reviewing for the channel because I find bigger videos or bigger topics more interesting. For instance, I recently finished these two books, Young Stalin and Stalin, the Court of the Red Tsar. If you want me to do a review of these, let me know. There's plenty I can say about them. I also recently reread The Waves by Virginia Woolf. I'm probably going to just review this just for myself. But if you really, really want me to review it, that would be certainly motivating. There's other books that I've been reading. You know, I've been kind of jumping in and out of Arnold Smith's Radio Dialogues 1 and 2. The books are way tinier than I expected, but you know, Arnold Smith is this weird experimental writer who plays with form, and basically these books are his literary criticism where he tackles the form of prior, sometimes obscure German, English, and American writers. And from an author who is so delicate with his relation between form and substance, it's nice to see him try to dissect the form and substance of other writers. I do think that this book is really only for the diehard fans. I kind of don't recommend this to begin with Arnold Smith. You should really just read Arnold Smith's other great works, but of course it's hard to get them and they're kind of expensive. So I don't know what I recommend in that regard. I kind of don't have a habit of sharing what I read because I've never had a Goodreads and I don't have social media. I don't have Facebook or Instagram or anything like that. So it's not normal for me to just be public facing and share things like that, but a few of you have left comments and have asked for me to share these sorts of things. So I hope this video was at least a little bit satisfying to you so that you could know what I'm engaged with. And like I keep saying in this video, let me know which particular books you want me to review. I don't think I have the time to review all of them, but I'll gladly talk about them at length if you're really, really interested. All the names to the books that I mentioned in this video are going to be in the description, so you can just copy and paste and check that out. And I'll see you around.